Hi. Good morning again. Before I start this morning's message, I just want to invite you to help me thank Mary Lynn Hudson, who preached a powerful sermon in my absence. Can we just give her a round of applause? She called us to consider the in-between places, those surprising and sacred points of connection in which God's story intersects with our own. This morning, I want to invite you to think with me about the inside places, the turned inward spaces. This Sunday, as we continue one step deeper into this season's worship theme of seeking Easter everywhere, I invite you to think about doubt, about love, and about the disciple named Thomas. But before we think about Thomas, I want to tell you about Lillian Virginia Sharkey Coleman. She was known to her friends as Ginger. She was known to me as Grandma, and as an infinitely kind person, a woman who never met a stranger, someone who knew every clerk in her local grocery store by name, as likely to offer them a sweet hello as she was a neatly folded $10 bill which she might slyly slip into their hand before walking away with her groceries. Grandma was an artist. Drawing was her primary medium, but she wasn't at all fancy with it. She'd doodle with any nearby number 2 pencil or ballpoint pen and make striking recreations of Bambi or a cartoon portrait of a family member. In each and every birthday card, you could expect to find little drawings of her, of my grandfather, and of you, whoever the lucky addressee might be. 3 cartoonish heads huddled together like a bundle of loving balloons. She was handy, able to repair lawnmowers and door locks and a whole variety of household staples. She was crafty, routinely taking old 2-liter soda bottles and transforming them into bird feeders. And still, with all her talents and skills, I think that what my grandmother did best was love. Without reservation or hesitation, I can say that she was one of only a handful of people that loved me unconditionally and believed I could do anything. However, after she passed away, other stories started to emerge, stories of a woman I had never met. Apparently, my grandmother was none too excited about me at first. My mother had made, in Ginger's judgment, a grave mistake by going and getting mixed up with a black man. Ginger had grown up in the 1940s and 50s in a family of hard-edged Scotch-Irish immigrants on the streets of St. Louis, in a family that was, we might call now, racist. She knew plenty of black folks and had apparently a decent opinion of them. Folks at that time likely would not have called her racist. Still, her youngest daughter having a child with a black person, that was a bridge too far. According to family lore, several months after I was born, my mother and grandparents took me on a trip with them to the beach. While we were there, my grandmother apparently obsessed over how much time I spent in the sun, demanding my mother only bring me out of the house for brief intervals, not because she was worried about the health of my infant skin, but rather because she worried that, as she said to my mother, "You just want that boy to be black, don't you?" When I began to hear these stories, I was surprised, but not shocked exactly. You see, in the late 80s, interracial couples and biracial babies weren't nearly as trendy as they are now. Nowadays, when a commercial shows some couples shopping for car insurance or a home mortgage, they're more often than not people of different races. Now, Years into building dissolves into divorce. When the child who once idealized and celebrated you turns into a teenager who can't seem to stand your presence. When the retirement everyone celebrated becomes a wasteland of free time you struggle to bear. When life takes a turn in a direction we didn't predict and we definitely did not want. It can be so easy to turn inward, to shut down, and to get locked up inside. This is where the disciples found themselves in today's reading. Right before the passage in our bulletins this morning, the Gospel of John reads that the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders. Now remember, in every single one of the gospel accounts of what happens after Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples are said to be afraid. They all immediately believed that their movement was over. In the four gospel stories, the disciples were convinced that this whole thing they'd been doing, this revolutionary practice of abundant welcome that made space for tax collectors and sex workers and lepers and poor folks and rich folks and even their greatest enemy, a Roman soldier. In every gospel, the disciples see Jesus die and are certain that their movement is finished. However, while in each story the disciples are grief stricken and fearful, they react to that fear very differently. In Luke's version of what takes place after the crucifixion, the disciples take a journey into another city. In Mark, they have a meal. In Matthew, they scale a mountain. But in John, the disciples go inside. They lock the doors. They shut themselves up, afraid and uncertain and probably angry and probably more. In John's gospel, the disciples' certainty is so frightening and so deep that they decide to wait out the fallout, locked up inside. They do that thing that so many of us do in response to fear or grief or anger or all of it. They turn inward. But blessedly, blessedly for the disciples and for every single one of us who has faced terrible pain and is shut up with fear or anger or anything else, blessedly for all of us, our God cannot be held back or held out or held off ever. Blessedly for all of us, even the locked up, turned inward spaces of our minds and hearts are places where the power and love called God can dwell. And that's what the disciples found out just a few verses before today's reading. They find that even in the midst of their dire fear and their terrible anger and their locked doors, Jesus appears to them. The new life of God finds them and speaks to them and consoles them and gives them breath. But Thomas missed it. We don't know where he was, but the Gospel of John reads, and you can follow along in your bulletins. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But Thomas said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, Jesus' disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them this time. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then Jesus said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have yet come to believe." Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing, you may have life in Jesus' name. So many incredible things happen in this passage, but we only have time today to think about two of them. First, after appearing to the disciples a week before, after breaking through the walls of their fear, and after traveling past the locked doors, and after visiting the disciples even when they had all but given up, God comes back again with the disciples, including Thomas, back in the house with the doors shut again and their fear still elevated. The resurrected Jesus comes back to that place all over again, because I would suggest to you, friends, that's what God does. Shows up when we're shut down, breaks through when we're turned in, blossoms forth when we are boarded up again and again and again. The other incredible thing I want to invite you to notice is what Thomas does. You see, it isn't enough for God to show up. Transformation isn't something that just happens to us. We have to be willing to touch, to reach, to move into God when she shows up. And that, friends, takes incredible courage. Sure, because of this passage, we know the disciple of note here as doubting Thomas. However, maybe we could also know him as courageous Thomas. After all, what else but courage leads us to not just observe God, but to reach for that power and love when it shows up? You see, friends, what Thomas found in that moment, in the core of his despair and his doubt and his fear, was not just God, but his own courage to reach for God. What he found, in other words, was purpose. Purpose that was deep and powerful and loving and bold, right on the rock bottom of the inside place, behind the locked doors, and within his fear and his grief and his anger, Thomas finds the courage to reach. And in fact, he kept reaching and became one of Christianity's most famous and far-reaching teachers, going as far east as India and some suspect China. Thomas found purpose right inside the place he had locked himself in, through the love and the courage it took for him to reach out and touch the God who visited and revisited and sought him out. Friends, where might God be visiting or revisiting you? What parts of your life or your feelings or your story have you locked yourself inside? Rather than reach out and try to distract from your pain, rather than look out and try to fix somebody else's as a way to pay less attention to your own, today's sacred story invites us to look around inside our own fear, inside our own grief and our fury and our pain. Today we consider how sometimes purpose isn't about a path we are bold enough to choose. Sometimes, maybe most times, purpose is about a challenge we are brave enough to accept. Sometimes it is about a willingness to be in our suffering, to see the ways that God is showing up again and again, and to at last reach out and meet her. One of the other reasons I was so surprised when I learned about my grandmother's warning, those worrying words of hers about how black the sun might make me, was because she and I spent so much time outside while I was growing up. Her backyard was a little St. Louis menagerie of wild animals that she fed and housed, and we would explore it every single visit. She knew just where the bunnies popped up and just where the groundhog was burrowing. She taught me what blue jays and robins and cardinals looked like. She collected little eggs and nursed fallen baby squirrels back to health. Far from being something to fear, the sun was something we celebrated as a source of life and beauty. I don't really know how Ginger Coleman transformed, but she did. She transformed into the grandmother who loved me and at times took a certain awkward joy in showing me off to the world, in fact. She was an avid St. Louis Cardinals baseball fan. And during my teen years, there was one Cardinal she was especially drawn to, a young Dominican player who had earned the nickname La Máquina, the machine. We'd be in line at the St. Louis Science Center or standing in the sun at Six Flags, and if she spotted anybody wearing any kind of Cardinals paraphernalia whatsoever, she would tap them on the shoulder, gesture to me, beaming with pride, and then ask with a smile, "Don't you think my grandson looks like Albert Pujols?" I would roll my eyes and awkwardly smile. They would look at her and then look at me and then look back at her and then shrug or nod politely in agreement. Lillian Virginia Sharkey Coleman would not have called herself an anti-racist activist. Still, I am certain that she challenged all kinds of people across Missouri who thought, as she once did, that loving family came in only one color at a time. Again, I really don't know how her mind changed or how her heart turned over. I really don't know how it happened, but I do believe I know what happened. In the midst of her suffering, God saw fit to drop a little brown, grasping grandbaby right into her lap. And then she had the courage to reach back, to break open the locked doors, to welcome in love, and to finally go outside, letting her biracial grandson get as dark as his melanated skin wanted to be. Friends, inside of whatever locked up, shut down place you might find yourself, God is visiting and inviting and revisiting and re-inviting you to reach out, to feel your way into new life, and to challenge yourself into real purpose. May it be so, and amen. We now worship God as we present our offerings.